One of the storylines that's still kind of being written about Republicans in the 21st century is whether or not Donald Trump's election in 2016 represents the beginning of a major multi-decade downfall for the Republican Party in the United States or not. And we don't know the answer yet. The 2020 election is going to be a big part of it, but we already have some data points. We already had Democrats taking over control of the House back in 2018 in the midterms by one of the larger margins in recent midterms. Anecdotally, because they ran, the serial sex assaulter Roy Moore in Alabama, Democrats took a Senate seat in Alabama, although it's likely that they're going to give that back in the 2020 election. But then at the state level, there have been some pretty major advancements. And last night, there were a bunch of statewide elections, and Republicans got absolutely crushed in some key places. And it could be, we don't know, but it could be a sign about what could happen in 2020 if we're ready to work. It always assumes that we're ready to work. So let's go through some of these. Kentucky. Kentucky's a very red state. Donald Trump won by 30 points over Hillary Clinton in 2016 in Kentucky. Kentucky had a Trump-loving governor named Matt Bevin. A major Democratic Party victory has taken place in Kentucky. The Democratic challenger, Andy Beshear, who is, I guess, for a little bit longer, the attorney general of the state, knocking out the Republican governor. This is Kentucky. This is not a blue or a purple state. It was a tiny margin, just about 5,000 votes. That's under 0.5% of the vote. But this is just a brutal loss, not just for Kentucky Republicans, but also for Trump because of what this race represents. Now, the immediate question after these results came in last night was if the Republican Kentucky governor lost, then maybe Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican senator from Kentucky, could also lose in Kentucky in 2020. It's hard to say. It's a very different race. McConnell is not as unpopular as Bevin had become over the last few months, although McConnell is not particularly popular. And there is actually more of a history in Kentucky, if you go back, of having Democratic governors. And there is not a similar, a likewise history of having Democratic senators. So we'll see. Either way, McConnell is going to have to run a campaign, right? He's going to have to run a real race against Amy McGrath, who's challenging him. He's not going to be able to just ignore the threat from her. That's a great race to work on, by the way, if you live in Kentucky. Or even if you don't, eventually, I'm sure there will be phone banking opportunities. So that's Kentucky. Let's go from Kentucky to Virginia. In Virginia, Democrats have taken over control of both the Virginia State House and the Virginia State Senate. They now are going to control the entire state legislature. They already have a Democratic governor, and Virginia is looking more and more like a blue state. Democrats have been out of power for 20 years in the Virginia House of Delegates, and they swept yesterday's election. So in Virginia, Democratic governor, Ralph Northam, Democratic House and Democratic Senate incoming. And Virginia has been it's interesting what's happened in Virginia. It's kind of sad, actually. They've been held back at the state level from adopting a lot of the policies that other solidly blue states have adopted. That could now change with Democrats taking over total control in Virginia. So that's a very good sign for Democrats. Here's another one. Democrats have taken over control of Mike Pence's hometown for the first time in almost 4 decades. Now, it's true, Columbus, Indiana, which most of you have never heard of, it's not a huge player on the national political stage. I agree with you. But in terms of the Trumpist element to this, Mike Pence is Donald Trump's vice president. His hometown has voted for Democrats to take over control of the city council, electing 4 Democrats to the city council, taking control for the first time there in 38 years. Even when you look at some of the races that Democrats lost last night, it still doesn't look good for Republicans. And I'll give you a really interesting example out of Minnesota, which is the governor's race there. When you look at the results out of Mississippi, not Minnesota. When you look at the Mississippi results from yesterday, you see that the Republican incumbent lieutenant governor, Tate Reeves, won, defeating the Democratic challenger, Jim Hood. Okay, it's Mississippi and a Republican won, but what does this really tell us? Well, what it tells us is this is one of the reddest states in the country. Trump won it by 17 points in 2016 over Hillary. In the 2015 gubernatorial election in Mississippi, the Republican won by 34 points. And last night, the Republican only won by 6. Turnout was up more than 70% overall, but Republican turnout was down by 6% in this race. That is terrible news for Republicans heading into 2020. And later on in the show, we're going to get into some of the battleground states. How much does national polling matter? We're going to start getting into the internals of a lot of this stuff. But if you want, I mean, listen, the Kentucky result from last night is great. The Virginia results from last night are great. But if you want to see a drastic change from years past and a major, major red flag for Republicans, it's that Mississippi, one of the reddest states in the country, which they often win in the gubernatorial races by more than 30 points, they only won by 6, with voter turnout disproportionately up, not from Republicans, but from Democrats and from independents. Terrible news from Republicans heading into 2020. We'll talk about 2020 a little bit more. If I missed, so I obviously didn't get to everything that happened yesterday, but if there are races that you think are important lenses through which we should be looking to 2020 that I didn't talk about today, get in touch and I will continue to cover the results on tomorrow's program.